War has a strange way of staying with you. Sometimes it stays not because of the battles you fought, but because of a single human moment you never expected. You can spend your entire life thinking about a man you met for less than 2 days. A man who was supposed to be your enemy. A man you were trained to kill. A man whose aircraft you shot out of the sky. And yet, without either of you planning it, that same man became part of the reason you survived. Then one day, decades later, when the war feels like another lifetime, the phone rings, and it's him. This story begins on April 27, 1940, high above the frozen mountains of Norway. On the calendar, it was spring. But in the mountains near the village of Grotli, winter still ruled absolutely. Snow buried the peaks. Ice coated the lakes. The wind cut through clothing like a blade. Germany had invaded Norway earlier that month, seeking control of key ports and supply routes, and the British Royal Navy was scrambling to respond. The skies over Norway had become hunting grounds. That morning, Captain Richard Partridge climbed into the cockpit of his Blackburn Skua. The Skua was not a sleek fighter. It was heavy, awkward, and slow compared to German aircraft, but it was sturdy and reliable. Sitting behind Partridge was Lieutenant Richard Bostock, acting as radio operator and rear gunner. Their mission was straightforward. Patrol north of Oslo, intercept German bombers, and bring them down. As they flew through broken cloud cover, Partridge spotted movement ahead. A formation of German Heinkel He-111 bombers, unescorted by fighters. It was a rare opportunity. As the British aircraft moved in, most of the bombers scattered immediately, turning away and diving for safety. But one bomber did not break formation, kept flying straight ahead. At its controls was Lieutenant Horst Scopes. For reasons only he could explain, Scopes chose not to flee. Perhaps he believed he could outrun them. Perhaps he refused to abandon course. Whatever the reason, his decision sealed the fate of his aircraft. Partridge led 3 skuas into a steep dive. Machine guns opened fire. Tracer rounds ripped into the German bomber's left engine. Flames erupted along the wing. Inside the Heinkel, alarms screamed, smoke filled the cockpit, and control began to slip away. Partridge watched as the bomber began to spiral downward, vanishing into the snow-covered mountains below. To Partridge, the engagement was over. The enemy aircraft was down. Mission accomplished. Then his own plane shuddered violently. German gunners, firing back until the very last second, had scored hits. Oil pressure dropped instantly. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then died. The Skua was no longer a combat aircraft. It was a heavy, uncontrollable glider falling toward some of the most unforgiving terrain in Europe. Partridge scanned the ground desperately. There were no fields, no roads, no safe clearings, only mountains, trees, and ice. Then, through the swirling snow, he spotted a frozen lake. It was the only option. He brought the Skua down as gently as possible. The aircraft slammed onto the ice, skidded violently, and finally came to a halt. Silence followed. Partridge and Bostock climbed out, shaken but alive. Their relief lasted only moments. They were deep in enemy territory. Their radio was destroyed. They had no food, no shelter, and night was already approaching. Temperatures were falling fast. As snow continued to drift down, Partridge noticed something in the distance. A small wooden structure barely visible against the white landscape. A reindeer hunter's cabin. It was their only chance. They forced their way through deep snow, pushed open the door, and stumbled inside. The cabin was crude but dry. They tried to warm themselves, stamping their feet, shaking off frost. For the first time since crashing, they felt a fragile sense of safety. Then they heard it. A sharp, unmistakable whistle outside. Someone else was out there. Miles away, high in the mountains, the German Heinkel had crashed violently. The impact killed Private Hans, the tail gunner, instantly. But 3 men survived: Horst Scopes, Sergeant Karl Strunk, and Corporal Joseph Ehlers. Injured and disoriented, they had crawled from the wreckage into a world of snow and silence. Like the British pilots, they knew they could not survive the night without shelter. They followed instinct and luck through the mountains. That instinct led them to the same cabin. As the Germans approached the door, Partridge and Bostock heard voices speaking German. Weapons were within reach. Tension filled the air. One wrong move could have turned the cabin into a killing ground. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The men met at the doorway. There was no shooting, no shouting, no sudden violence. Hands were extended. They shook hands in what Partridge later described as a continental manner. In that moment, the war outside the cabin seemed to pause. They were enemies by uniform alone. Inside the cabin, they were simply men trying not to freeze to death. That first night, space was tight. The Germans stayed in the small hunter's cabin, while Partridge and Bostock discovered a larger building nearby, the WWII Hotel. It was closed for the winter, abandoned but intact, offering better shelter. When morning came, the Germans spotted the hotel and made their way there. Inside, both crews searched cupboards and storerooms and, incredibly, found enough food for a proper meal. Bread, butter, preserves, coffee. On April 28, 1940, 5 men who had been shooting at each other only hours earlier sat together around a dining table and shared breakfast. They spoke in broken English and German. Smiles replaced suspicion. No one wanted to talk about who had shot down whom. Partridge even claimed he was from a bomber crew, not the fighter pilot responsible for the German crash. Whether the Germans believed him or not hardly mattered. There was an unspoken agreement that the war remained outside the hotel walls. For 2 days they lived together. They cooked, they talked, they laughed awkwardly at the absurdity of it all. Snow fell outside as if the world itself wanted to keep them hidden. But reality could not be avoided forever. They knew they had to find help. So they set out together through the snow, British and German, side by side, rifles slung, boots crunching across ice. It was during this journey that fate turned cruel again. They encountered a Norwegian ski patrol. Sergeant Strunk panicked and reached for his pistol. The Norwegians fired instantly, killing him on the spot. Skopies and Ehlers surrendered immediately. They were captured and eventually shipped to prisoner-of-war camps in Canada, where they would remain for the rest of the war. Partridge and Bostock convinced the Norwegians they were British officers. After days of travel, hiking through mountains and commandeering a car, they reached a British-held port just in time to escape Norway. But war was not finished with them. On June 13, 1940, Partridge and Bostock flew another mission, this time attacking the German battleship Scharnhorst. Both aircraft were shot down. Bostock was killed. Partridge was captured and spent the next 5 years as a prisoner of war in German camps. When the war ended, both men survived but changed. Partridge became one of the first Royal Navy pilots qualified to fly jet aircraft. Skopies settled in Canada and built a life as a businessman. For 37 years, they did not see each other. But neither ever forgot that breakfast in Norway. In 1977, Horst Skopies picked up the phone and called Richard Partridge. 2 former enemies met again, this time as friends. They met in London, then Munich. They visited each other's homes, shared stories, and laughed at the sheer improbability of their survival. They spoke of those who had not made it, Bostock, Strunk, and the others. Both men wrote books and both told the same story. The story of the moment when war stopped being war. In 1974, Partridge's Blackburn skua was recovered from the frozen lake where it had rested for 34 years and placed in the Fleet Air Arm Museum in England. Skopies' Heinkel still lies in the Norwegian mountains, too remote to retrieve. In 2004, at the age of 92, Skopies returned to WWII one last time. Partridge had passed away years earlier, but his son Simon joined him. They stood together in the mountains where their fathers had once been enemies. Skopies, emotional, said, "What happened in that cabin was different. That was humanity." He died in 2011 at the age of 99. Their story later inspired the film Into the White. 2 pilots, one German, one British. They shot each other down, and then, by pure chance, met at the same door in the snow. For a brief moment in 1940, the war stopped, and 37 years later, they met again, not as enemies but as brothers. Because sometimes, the line between friend and foe is as thin as a cabin door in the snow.